Hey everyone, so I wanted to make a quick video review on this, Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. Let me just say right off the bat, I don't think I like this book as much as most other people do. I do still think it's a totally fine read, but it's definitely not a great book in my opinion. And honestly, I thought the book was a little overrated. And yes, I know Brandon Sanderson is like the biggest name in fantasy right now, but I've read 5 books by him, including this one, and I really gotta say, I don't think I'm much of a Sanderson fan. At least right now with what I've read. Every book I've read by Brandon Sanderson has been fine, or even good, but none of them have been great. On the flip side though, I haven't hated any of his books either, although Frugal Wizard's Guide was probably the book that got closest to me actually disliking it. But also, all the books I've read by Sanderson haven't really stuck with me, and none of the books I've read are books I want to go back and read again, or continue reading additional books in the series like Mistborn. I only read the first Mistborn book, really didn't have any interest in continuing that series off of that first book. And with this, although it is a standalone book, it's not part of a series, it really doesn't make me want to read other standalone books that Sanderson has written in his Cosmere universe. I do know I need to read his Stormlight Archive series to really judge Sanderson as an author, because that is his, magnum opus. I do plan on getting to that series at some point in the future, but probably not for a little while. And I actually did a little skit on Brandon Sanderson and whether he's a fantastic author on my YouTube channel. Shameless self-plug. But anyway, this book falls in line with other Sanderson books that I've read in the past, as in it's a fine book, it's borderline a good book, but it's definitely not a book I would consider great, at least not in my opinion. The best thing I can say about Sanderson is that he's very consistent. Consistent in his output and consistent in his quality. And I know that is actually a very big plus, especially if you consider some other authors in the fantasy genre. But this is a review on Warbreaker, not a review on Brandon Sanderson, the author. So with all that being said, don't expect this video to be me just gushing all over this book or gushing all over Brandon Sanderson, because it's not going to be that. I'm also not just going to complain about this book and crap all over it, because it's definitely not a bad book in my opinion either. There are certainly some aspects to this book that I really enjoyed, but there's also some aspects that I didn't enjoy. So let's dive into my review. First things first, I will say that I'm not going to spoil anything about this book in this video, so don't worry about spoilers if you want to go into this book blind. Let's talk about some of the most important aspects of a book, which is of course the story, the characters, the setting and world building, and then the prose and pacing of the story. Starting off with the story, and right off the bat, I will say that this story probably wasn't really for me. So I'm not just going to sit here and complain about the story when it didn't click with me, because this story has clearly clicked with a lot of other people, and I can see how some people would really enjoy this story, but for me personally, I just didn't really enjoy it that much. I just found the story, or at least a good chunk of the story, to be a little boring. To give the briefest and most concise summary of this story, it is essentially about this princess being forced to marry the God King in order to stave off an impending war. Instead of sending the oldest daughter, which is what was originally signed in the treaty, the king actually decides to send his youngest daughter instead. The story then follows these princesses as they are put in these very difficult situations. There is, of course, way more to the story than just that, but that is pretty much the gist of the story without delving into any spoilers. And as I'm starting to notice with Sanderson, the story isn't at all what you expect it to be. There are some twists and revelations in this story that happen near the end, and if you are familiar with Sanderson, you'll understand what I mean. The problem with this, though, is that it's starting to become a little cliché to me. Now, whenever I go into a book by Brandon Sanderson, I'm kind of expecting the story to go off the rails and there to be twists and revelations that not only impact the story, but also the characters as well. Honestly, if there were no twists to this story, that probably would have been a bigger twist for me because it's something I wouldn't have been expecting. I always kind of expect twists now. Again, keep in mind this is only the 5th book I've read by Brandon Sanderson, but I am starting to notice a little bit of a formula here. But back to the story, like I said, it really didn't interest me all that much. There certainly were aspects to the story that I did enjoy, but overall, and especially the first half of the book, I was just pretty bored reading it. But like I said, that is just my opinion, and I'm sure this book would click with a lot of other people. In fact, I'm pretty certain it does. I mean, just perusing the internet for a couple minutes, you will notice that a lot of people love this story. So I'm not really knocking this book when the story doesn't click for me personally. And even though the story didn't click with me, I can notice that there is definitely a really fascinating story lurking just beneath the surface. With a lot of political intrigue and plots within plots, it definitely is fascinating if you factor that in. But unfortunately, the story really doesn't focus on any of that. Instead, it seems like Brandon Sanderson really just wanted to focus on the 2 main characters instead of all that other stuff that was happening in the background. I just thought that was a little unfortunate because I probably would have found this story to be a lot more fascinating if it did branch out just a little bit more than it did. And hey, I mean, maybe I'm just here complaining about this book not providing me with something that Brandon Sanderson never really wanted to tell in the beginning. It would be like going into a Stephen King book and then being upset that it wasn't a lighthearted romance story. So, in that case, maybe you should have read something different then, right? And yeah, that's right, that's totally fine. But with this book, it just seemed like it was so close to being a really fascinating story if Sanderson just changed a couple things about it. I just kind of thought that was a little unfortunate. I gotta say though, one thing that really bothered me was the fact that the priests wanted the main character to provide the God King with a child. However, the priests instructed the character not to talk to the God King and actually not even to look at him. So how did the priests expect that to play out? Maybe they were just expecting the God King to take the lead on that? However, again, there is a very big problem with that, but I won't get into details because I don't want to spoil the story. I will just say that I thought that was pretty stupid. Seems like kind of a huge fault with the priest's motive and also with the story itself. So that's my opinion of the story. Now let's talk about the characters. There's 2 main characters. Number 1 is Ciri, the younger sister that's being forced to marry the God King. And then there's the older sister, Vivenna, who was originally supposed to be the one to marry the God King. This book does, of course, include way more characters than just Ciri and Vivenna, but the story does focus on them the most. So for the majority of the time, you're going to be reading about their struggles and what they're going through. Both of these characters are fine, I guess. I mean, they're not bad characters, they're not good characters, they're just, typical run-of-the-mill kind of characters. The one thing I kind of like, though, is the fact that they're polar opposites of each other, which siblings often are, and seeing how they react and deal with the situations they're placed in was pretty interesting. And also seeing how they grow and change throughout this story, that was actually probably the most interesting part of the story, at least for me. What I really like is that Ciri would have performed way better in Vivenna's circumstance, and Vivenna obviously would have performed much better in Ciri's circumstance. So they kind of had a little bit of a role reversal where they were both placed in difficult situations. However, if the roles were reversed, then the situations wouldn't have been nearly as difficult for them. Of course, then the story would have been completely different as well. I also really like how Vivenna really grew and matured and actually became more like her younger sister by the end of the story. I thought that was pretty interesting. And the reason this story goes to the places it does is because these characters are placed into situations that they are wholly unprepared for. On a more negative point, I will say that throughout reading this book, I was always interested to see, or at least maybe get a glimpse of what was going on with Ceres and Vivenna's father. So clearly the main characters and their struggles weren't really pulling me in, at least not completely. Because, from my personal opinion, and as a dad myself, I know I'm totally biased here, but I wanted to know what was going on in his head and what he was doing to save or protect his daughters, knowing that they were potentially in danger. And I know you can't always expect books to go in depth on all of the characters, especially some characters that you want to get more details on, because then that would make books overly long. But just from my personal opinion, I do wish that this story at least branched out a little bit more with some of the characters, especially with their father. And just like my complaint with the story, I'm probably just complaining about something that Sanderson never even wanted to write about anyways. So again, not really a fault with the book, but it definitely did hamper my enjoyment with it. Like I said, other than Ciri and Vivenna, there are of course a lot of other secondary and less important characters to the story as well. And of course, the whole cast of characters really helps flesh out the story and the world as a whole. And overall, I would say that the characters are fine. They more or less kept me engaged throughout the story. I just wish it branched out a little bit more. That was essentially just my main complaint. Next, let's talk about setting and world building. This is the one thing that I think Sanderson always excels at. The worlds he builds are so well fleshed out and realized, it's really fascinating. Reading his books is almost like stepping into a dream. And with Warbreaker, he really continues to excel at this aspect of writing. I believe Sanderson spends the perfect amount of time describing scenes and setting the environment. He doesn't waste tons of time describing every little thing. He describes just enough detail to provide the author with a visual of what the setting looks like, and then as the reader, you kind of fill in the gaps with your imagination. He also creates some of the most unique worlds you can read about in the fantasy genre, at least from what I've experienced. And I find world building and setting to be one of the most important parts of fantasy. After all, the whole reason for reading fantasy is to really get stuck and placed into this wondrous world, and Sanderson really excels at that. If you are familiar with Sanderson, then you also know that his magic systems that he writes in these books are also some of the best in the fantasy genre as well. And of course, in this book, once again, Sanderson nails it. And finally, let's talk about the pacing and the prose. I gotta say, the pacing was probably my biggest issue with this book. I thought the first half was a total slog to get through. I was just waiting and waiting for something interesting to happen. And really, I was tempted to put this book down multiple times. And looking back over my notes, yes, I know, I have notes. I'm a total nerd. But looking over my notes, I didn't really start to get engaged by the story until nearly page 400, which is roughly the halfway point of this book. I don't want to make it sound like the first half of this book is completely boring. There are certainly some interesting things that take place in the first half, but overall, it was just so slow to get the story really going. And I remember I was just thinking, okay, let's get to the point. Is something interesting going to happen? When are they going to get to the point? Let's go. And I kept thinking that more and more as I kept reading until the halfway point. Because at the halfway point, then the story really started to pick up, and that's when I finally started to get engaged by both the story and by the characters. Unfortunately, the ending of this book also has some really big pacing issues in my opinion. There was just so much build up and so much stuff going on, and then finally you get to the climax and then it just seemed to be quick, quick, quick. Everything was done. Everything was resolved way too quickly. Just seemed like the ending was really too rushed. So the first half of the book, kind of boring. The second half of the book, much better. And the ending, yeah, it was just way too rushed in my opinion. So yeah, I really thought the pacing was pretty uneven. And talking about Prose, I will say that this is a very typical Sanderson book. As in, the writing style is pretty basic. And I don't mean that as a negative or an insult. I mean it more as this book is very easy to pick up and read and get engaged by pretty much anyone. The vocabulary and prose that Sanderson uses throughout the story is very basic, but he does get his point across. It just doesn't come off as too flowery or too metaphorical or anything like that. It's just very basic language, and that, honestly, I think that's kind of a good thing, because that means more people can sit down and enjoy reading this book. And overall, I would just say that the prose and language that Sanderson uses is very effective in telling this story. So, in conclusion, like I said at the beginning of this video, I thought this book was fine. It's borderline good, but it's certainly not great. There are certainly more positive aspects to this book than there are negative aspects, hence the reason my enjoyment overall was positive. Especially the world building and some aspects to the story I absolutely loved. Unfortunately, those pacing issues really hampered my enjoyment overall of this book. And hey, maybe I am being a little nitpicky. In fact, I probably am. But whatever, I think it's good to be nitpicky, at least in regards to some things. After reading this, I think I'm gonna take a little bit of a Brandon Sanderson break. There are just so many other books that I really want to read, and I'm kind of getting a little tired of Sanderson's style of books. So probably after reading this, I'm going to take a little bit of a break. However, I do want to end up reading his Stormlight Archive series, at least at some point in the future, maybe in a year or so though. But yeah, anyways, that is my review of Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. If you have any comments, let me know down below, or if you've read this book and have a conflicting opinion, let me know down below as well. I really like reading conflicting opinions. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I will see you all again next time. Bye-bye.